General Hospital spoiler reveal that Rocco had never felt fear settle so heavily on his chest, a cold weight pressing against every breath. But the moment news broke that Charlotte had escaped the PCPD, something inside him fractured in a way he could not hide anymore. He had kept her secret for as long as he could, clinging to the fragile trust she placed in him, convincing himself he was protecting her, that telling an adult would somehow betray whatever little strength she had left. Yet the second he saw Lulu's face pale with panic, he realized silence had become its own kind of cruelty. The house felt too small for the storm brewing inside him, every corner echoing with the memory of Charlotte's trembling hands and haunted eyes. And when Lulu demanded answers, when Nathan stepped closer with that steady voice that always made truth harder to avoid, the words slipped from Rocco before he even understood he had spoken them. He confessed everything: how Charlotte had been meeting Valentine in secret, how she had begged him not to tell anyone, how she was convinced that Valentine was the only person who understood the chaos spiraling inside her, and the confession hung in the air, like a spark thrown onto dry wood, igniting an instant wildfire of dread that consumed Lulu from the inside out. Lulu staggered back, a hand pressed to her chest as though Rocco's words were knives rather than worries, because the possibility that Charlotte had run straight toward the one man Lulu feared most shattered any illusion of safety she had been clinging to. It was not just a child fleeing the police anymore. It was a child seeking refuge in the shadow of someone who had already twisted her sense of loyalty, identity, and truth. Nathan tried to calm the room, but even his voice trembled with the weight of what Rocco had revealed. Because this was no longer just a search, this was an unraveling of everything they thought they understood about Charlotte's mind and the darkness pulling her back toward Valentine. Rocco watched Lulu struggle to breathe, and guilt washed over him in crushing waves, because he realized he had been sitting on the very information that could have kept Charlotte from slipping deeper into the danger now swallowing her. He remembered the day Charlotte whispered to him that Valentine wasn't gone, that he wasn't hiding out of fear but out of necessity, that he still cared for her, that he needed her. And Rocco had believed her because she needed someone to believe her. But now, with Lulu's eyes filling with tears of despair and Nathan pacing the room, the truth twisted into something more sinister, something that suggested Charlotte's connection to Valentine was no longer emotional comfort, but psychological captivity. Every thought spiraled into the next, painting a picture of Charlotte lost somewhere between loyalty and manipulation, desperate to reclaim control over her life but slipping further away with every secret she carried. Lulu kept asking Rocco to repeat what Charlotte had said, searching for hidden meanings, hoping there was some sliver of misunderstanding that would make the situation less dangerous. But every word he repeated only deepened her fear that Valentine had been preparing this escape, nurturing this bond, pulling Charlotte closer even from the shadows. Nathan's jaw tightened as he processed the implications, because if Valentine had orchestrated this, if he had used Charlotte's vulnerability as a weapon, then the search would not be a simple manhunt. It would be a confrontation with a man desperate enough, cornered enough, and dangerous enough to use Charlotte as his last shield. Rocco felt his stomach twist as Nathan stepped away to call the station, watching Lulu sink onto the couch, shaking, whispering Charlotte's name as though saying it could anchor her daughter back to reality. The weight of responsibility crushed Rocco, because he knew that telling the truth had been necessary, yet he couldn't silence the voice inside him whispering that he had broken Charlotte's trust, that she would never forgive him if she learned he had handed her secrets to the very people she feared would take her freedom away. He had done what was right, but right did not feel comforting. It felt like betrayal dressed up as duty. Lulu finally looked at him, really looked at him, and despite the grief in her eyes, she reached out and held his hand, her fingers trembling but warm, a silent expression of gratitude he didn't feel he deserved. She told him he did the right thing, but her voice cracked in a way that made the words feel less like reassurance, and more like a fragile prayer she needed to believe in to keep herself from collapsing. The house grew colder with every passing minute, the air soaked with fear and dread and a suffocating sense of helplessness as they waited for news, knowing each second allowed Valentine to pull Charlotte deeper into whatever plan he had spun from the darkness. Rocco's mind replayed every encounter he had with Charlotte, every moment she had seemed on the verge of breaking, every time he had tried to help and failed to understand what she truly needed. She had been unraveling long before she disappeared from the PCPD, and he realized he had mistaken her silence for resilience, her secrets for strength. Now, those secrets had become the very thing threatening to destroy her. He imagined Charlotte wandering through the shadows of Windermere, calling out for Valentine, believing she was walking towards safety but unknowingly stepping into a tightening trap, and the thought hollowed him out with terror. Lulu wiped her eyes, her voice barely steady as she insisted they would find her, but even she seemed unsure whether she was promising herself or pleading with fate. Nathan returned to the room with grim news the police had reason to believe. Charlotte had already crossed into Spoon Island. The moment the words left his mouth, Lulu's expression shattered completely, and Rocco felt the room tilt around him as guilt surged again, sharper than before. Suddenly, every confession he had made felt like a key Valentine could exploit, a breadcrumb trail leading Charlotte deeper into danger. But there was no turning back now. The truth had been unleashed, and all they could do was chase it before it swallowed Charlotte whole. Nathan reassured Lulu that they would reach Windermere in time, but even he seemed haunted by the possibility that they were already too late. Rocco felt smaller than he had ever felt, a child caught at the center of a storm far bigger than he could comprehend. Yet he stood firm beside Lulu, determined to be there no matter how the night ended. Something had shifted irreversibly within Charlotte, within Lulu, within the fragile web that held their family together, and the weight of that shift pulsed through the room like an omen. As they prepared to leave, Rocco glanced back toward the door, half expecting Charlotte to appear, half praying she would, because he knew the path she was walking toward Valentine was one lined with shadows. She was not equipped to face alone. But the doorway remained empty, silent, and cold, and in that stillness, Rocco realized this night would change everything. That nothing before Charlotte's escape would ever feel the same again, and whatever awaited them at Windermere would shape not only her future but the fate of everyone who loved her. There was a heaviness in the air that neither Nathan nor Lulu could shake, a kind of quiet distortion that grew stronger every time Charlotte's name was spoken aloud, as if reality itself was being adjusted in ways they were only beginning to understand. What had started as a desperate effort to track down a missing child had slowly evolved into something darker, a shifting of truths beneath their feet that left both of them feeling as though they were running through fog that thickened with every passing hour. Charlotte had disappeared before. Charlotte had rebelled before. Charlotte had defied authority more times than either of them could count. But this was not rebellion. This was not a frightened girl acting on impulse or confusion. This was something far more deliberate, something calculated. And the more Nathan and Lulu pieced together the fragments she left behind, the more certain they became that Charlotte was adjusting to a new internal map neither of them had access to. But the most disturbing part wasn't simply Charlotte's vanishing act, it was the unmistakable involvement of Danny. That changed everything. Danny was not impulsive like Charlotte, nor reckless, nor driven by bursts of erratic emotion. He was steady, thoughtful, a boy who rarely broke rules and almost never walked into danger willingly. For him to run with Charlotte, to protect her, to scheme with her, meant something inside him had shifted just as radically as whatever transformation Charlotte was experiencing. It was no longer possible to dismiss their disappearance as simple youthful defiance, because children who ran out of fear scattered chaotically, tripped over inconsistencies, exposed their panic. Children who ran with a plan, however, those were the ones who terrified parents, detectives, and anyone with common sense. Nathan knew that kind of coordination only emerged when a deeper truth had taken hold, a truth strong enough to eclipse fear and override reason. Lulu couldn't stop pacing the room, one hand pressed against her forehead as though trying to keep her thoughts from splintering apart. Every new clue unraveled her further. Every whisper that Charlotte had been preparing for this moment, every hint that Danny had been drawn into it willingly, made the air feel colder and the night feel longer. The fear clawing at her was no longer the simple terror of a mother whose child had run away. It was the dawning awareness that Charlotte was operating with intention, not panic. Lulu tried to make sense of each detail, tried to understand the subtle behavioral changes she had dismissed over the past few weeks. Charlotte's long silences, her sudden bursts of energy, the way she stared at windows as if mapping something beyond them, the nights she stayed awake whispering to someone on the phone, the way she shut down whenever Lulu asked too many questions. All of these moments now whereupon together into a single terrifying realization. Charlotte had been adjusting her entire world, in preparation for something far larger than anyone realized. Nathan felt it too, though he tried to hide it beneath the calm authority he had always relied on. Each hour that passed tightened the coil of dread twisting through him. He could see Lulu unraveling, but he also saw the deeper truth. The children were not lost. They were hiding. They were moving. They were choosing secrecy over safety. And that meant they believed in something neither adult had been able to detect in time. Danny's involvement was the most troubling part. He had sworn he would help Charlotte. He had stood beside her when the pressure became unbearable. He had kept her secrets, whispered reassurances, followed her plans. It was as if Charlotte had infected him with her urgency, her fears, her obsessions, adjusting him the same way she had adjusted herself. Together, they had become something frightening to children convinced they were carrying out a mission no one else could understand. Nathan and Lulu examined every clue, a discarded note torn to pieces, Charlotte's drawings filled with strange shapes, Danny's cryptic message about not letting her fall. The sudden shifts in their behavior leading up to Charlotte's escape from the PCPD. None of it felt random. Everything felt meticulously arranged, as if the children were 2 steps ahead at all times, predicting how adults would react, crafting a plan around that prediction. And beneath all of it, something darker pulsed, the unmistakable sense that a new obsession had taken hold of Charlotte's mind, one strong enough to warp her decisions and pull Danny into its gravitational force. This obsession, whatever it was, had become the anchor guiding both children, adjusting their perceptions, pushing them towards something bigger, something more dangerous. Lulu replayed Rocco's confession over and over in her head, the secret meetings with Valentine, the whispered promises, Charlotte's insistence that Valentine wasn't hiding from the world, he was preparing for it. The words echoed inside her like a warning she had ignored. Valentine's influence had always lingered at the edges of Charlotte's mind. But if Charlotte had been meeting him in secret, listening to him, trusting him above everyone else, then perhaps the changes within her had not emerged naturally, they had been shaped intentionally. And if Valentine had learned Danny was emotionally vulnerable enough to be swayed by a cause he didn't fully understand, that made everything worse. Lulu's heart twisted painfully. The idea that Valentine had somehow manipulated both children, guiding them into a plan they believed they had created themselves, was almost horrifying to consider. But the pieces aligned too neatly to ignore. Nathan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay grounded. He didn't want to scare Lulu further, but every instinct in his body screamed that they were running out of time. Charlotte and Danny were not drifting. They were advancing. They were correcting their path in response to every obstacle, adjusting faster than Nathan could predict. And that meant the window to intervene before they went somewhere adults could not easily reach was closing rapidly. Every movement Nathan made felt too slow. Every step he took felt like trying to catch a shadow already fading into the distance. Lulu's breathing grew unsteady as new possibilities clawed at her mind. What if Charlotte believed she was saving Valentine? What if she believed Danny was meant to help her? What if their plan had layers no one had uncovered yet? What if they were not just hiding but preparing to confront something or someone? The terror came from not knowing. The obsession came from trying to understand. The obsession spread, traveling from Charlotte to Danny, and now bleeding into Nathan and Lulu, infecting the room with a growing sense of inevitability. Each moment felt like a countdown to a revelation they feared more than the silence itself. Nathan finally spoke, voice low, tense. Each word weighted with the urgency he could no longer suppress. They had to find the children now, before the adjustment in their behavior became irreversible. Lulu nodded mechanically, but inside she felt as though she were dissolving, her thoughts fragmenting under the pressure of too many unknowns. The truth wasn't simply changing, it was mutating, shifting, rearranging itself into a pattern no adult had recognized soon enough. The children were already acting on this new truth, their minds aligned, their intentions woven together through fear and loyalty and manipulation. Charlotte had become the catalyst, Danny the accomplice, and whatever plan they were following had already begun. And so Nathan and Lulu stepped into the night, driven by a fear so sharp it felt like a blade pressed against their ribs. Both of them sensing that this search would not end with simple answers or easy resolutions. Something had awakened inside Charlotte. Something had taken hold of Danny. Something had adjusted the truth into a new form. And now that truth was pulling them all toward a moment from which none of their lives would ever return unchanged. Nathan felt the night closing around them like a tightening net as he and Lulu followed the direction Rocco had described. Each step forward weighted with the dreadful awareness that they were not simply chasing a runaway child, they were chasing the echoes of a mind already reshaped by something far larger than either of them could yet comprehend. The uncertainty gnawed at them, carving deeper wounds into already strained nerves. Because every piece of information Rocco shared pointed to a disturbing truth. Charlotte was no longer reacting to the chaos in her life, she was steering it. This new adjustment in her behavior wasn't random. It was intentional, precise, and frighteningly determined. Rocco's voice had trembled when he admitted Charlotte had been meeting Valentine in secret, whispering rushed stories about danger, about responsibility, about things she insisted only she could fix. And now, as Nathan and Lulu made their way through the dark towards Spoon Island, the reality of that confession pressed harder and harder against their chests. Charlotte wasn't hiding from the police, she was protecting someone she believed needed her protection. That single belief was enough to push her into danger without hesitation. It wasn't childish rebellion, it was devotion built on fractured truths. It was a new version of Charlotte, a girl who had adjusted her own sense of duty into something terrifyingly absolute. Lulu's mind spiraled as she walked, the thick silence of the night amplifying every fear she had spent years trying to outrun. She had always known Valentine's influence lingered beneath Charlotte's skin, like a shadow impossible to scrub away. But she had believed hope that distance and time would loosen that grip. Yet Rocco's confession proved the opposite. That grip had tightened, grown sharper, grown secret, twisting its way into Charlotte's heart until she believed saving Valentine was her calling. Lulu's steps faltered under the weight of that realization. Because once a child became convinced they alone could prevent a disaster, they became unpredictable, unstoppable, willing to sacrifice themselves in the name of love, fear, or warped responsibility. And Charlotte, in her increasingly fragile emotional state, was a perfect target for manipulation. Lulu's breath caught at the possibility that the adjustment Charlotte was experiencing had been carefully engineered by Valentine, planted in her through whispers, promises, and half-truths that painted him as a hunted man in desperate need of rescue. The more Lulu thought about it, the more she understood the magnitude of the disaster already unfolding around them. Nathan tried to center himself, but his training could only do so much against a truth layered with this much emotional volatility. Children like Charlotte didn't act accidentally. Their movements had purpose. Their choices followed patterns shaped by something deep and unwavering. He kept reviewing her recent behavior, the long glances over her shoulder, the restless pacing, the strange intensity in her eyes whenever Valentine's name was mentioned. He had tried to dismiss those signs as the stress of her rest, of her turbulent history, of the complicated grief she refused to face. But now he saw them clearly for what they were, the early stages of psychological reorientation, a mental adjustment toward a goal she couldn't share but also couldn't resist. Danny's involvement only magnified the danger. Children didn't form alliances like this unless they believed in a shared truth. Danny's desire to protect Charlotte may have begun as friendship, but it had evolved into something more binding, loyalty sharpened by fear, fueled by secrecy, strengthened by the belief that adults could not be trusted with whatever truth they believed they possessed. Nathan recognized that dynamic instinctively. He had seen it in teenagers swept into dangerous movements, in children manipulated by the idea that they were soldiers in someone else's war. But seeing it in Charlotte, and Danny shook him to his core. Lulu kept replaying every moment leading up to Charlotte's escape. The sudden mood shifts, the quiet muttering at night, the refusal to discuss Valentine, the way she flinched whenever Lulu asked whether she missed him. Each of those moments had seemed emotional, chaotic, painful, but now they formed a chain, each link revealing an adjustment Charlotte had been making internally, shifting her reality towards something she felt compelled to protect at all costs. That realization hit Lulu harder than anything else. Charlotte wasn't running from fear. She was running toward responsibility, toward danger, toward Valentine. It was a catastrophic shift in her psychology, and Lulu felt powerless against it. Nathan, sensing Lulu's rising panic, walked faster, scanning every shadow, aware that they might already be too late. If Charlotte had reached Windermere, the situation could spiral beyond their control. Windermere wasn't just a hiding place, it was a fortress of secrets, a sanctuary for Valentine, a place where Charlotte's emotional defenses would crumble completely in the face of his influence. And Danny, drawn into Charlotte's world, would follow her unquestioningly, becoming another pawn in a chess game he didn't even understand. Nathan felt a knot twisting in his stomach as he imagined what the children might believe. They were saving Valentine from legal trouble, enemies, some imagined danger, or something real, something Valentine had convinced Charlotte only she could stop. The possibilities no longer mattered. All that mattered was that Charlotte believed it. And when a child believed a danger existed, the danger became real, if not in the world, then in their mind. And the mind, when warped by fear and loyalty, became the perfect breeding ground for disaster. The darkness around them deepened as the shoreline came into view. Spoon Island looming like a forgotten relic, its silhouette sharp against the water. Lulu felt her heartbeat stutter. This was where Valentine always retreated when cornered. This was where Charlotte felt closest to him. This was where secrets were born and buried and reborn. As Zachariah had once said to her long ago, some places don't hold memories, they feed them. Windermere was one of those places, and Lulu felt it in her bones that Charlotte had been pulled toward it like a magnet, like destiny, like an obsession she could no longer resist. Nathan slowed as they reached the boat, listening to the soft lap of water against the wood, the quiet that seemed too deliberate, too expectant. Fear thickened the air. This wasn't just a search anymore. This was an intervention against forces that had already tangled too deeply into Charlotte's psyche. The children believed they were protecting Valentine. They believed they were preventing a catastrophe. But in truth, they were creating one. Each step they took brought them closer to a situation that could explode without warning. And Nathan and Lulu both sensed it. Something was waiting for them on that island. Something shaped by whispered conversations between Charlotte and Valentine. Something strengthened by the quiet adjustment of Danny's loyalty. Something fed by secrets neither child should have been burdened with. The night itself felt like it was holding its breath. as if aware that one wrong move could ignite the disaster already simmering beneath the surface. As they boarded the boat, Lulu's hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the overwhelming truth she could no longer deny. Charlotte wasn't acting alone, wasn't confused, wasn't lost. She was executing a plan she believed in. A plan built on a secret. A secret heavy enough to bend her entire world. A secret she was prepared to protect even if it cost her everything. And that secret, whatever it was, had the power to reshape not only her fate, but the fate of Valentine, Danny, and anyone who stepped into its path. Nathan started the engine, eyes fixed on the dark outline of Spoon Island. Lulu swallowed hard, bracing herself, because she knew with absolute certainty, they were no longer trying to prevent a disaster. The disaster had already begun. And Charlotte, fragile, haunted, devoted Charlotte was at the center of it, driving it forward with every step she took toward Valentine.